You spend most of your life working, most of your week, most of your energy, most of your attention. And if I ask you why, most people don't really know. Not what you do. Why? Money? Security? Peace of mind? A good life? We all have an answer ready. But if you stay with the question a bit longer, something strange starts to happen. Every answer opens another question. Money for what? Security for what? Peace for what? A good life, what does that even mean? And if you keep going, you reach a point where the questions stop. Not because you found the final answer, but because you don't question it anymore. Something sits there, at the top, quietly, and whether you realize it or not, that thing organizes your life. Let's make it concrete. Imagine you receive a job offer. Twice the salary, better title, more successful on paper. But there's a trade-off. You would see your family half as often. You would come home tired, less present, less available. Now what? You open a spreadsheet, you compare numbers, you calculate how much more you could save. You think about the future, maybe a bigger house, more security, more options. Everything looks better, but something doesn't feel resolved. Because the real question isn't numerical. What matters more? Money or time with your family? And the uncomfortable part is, you already know the answer. You just don't know how to justify it with data. At that moment, the problem changes. It's no longer about information, it's about what comes first. Modern culture is built on facts, evidence, data, verification. And that's a good thing. Facts matter. Science works, medicine works, technology works, the phone in your pocket works. But facts have a limit. They're incredibly good at telling you what is. They're not very good at telling you what matters more. They can describe your options, they can't rank your life. And the most important decisions you make are always about ranking. This isn't just a personal problem, it appears in science too. Take the beginning of the universe, Big Bang. Everything that exists compressed into a single point, no space, no time. Then suddenly, expansion. Time begins, space unfolds. Scientists can describe this with equations. They can simulate it, they can measure its effects. But try to imagine it. No, really, imagine it. Immediately your brain does something interesting. It creates a scene. You are floating somewhere in space, maybe standing on a rock, watching the universe expand in front of you. But none of that is real. There was no rock, no observer, no outside. Yet your brain insists on building the scene, because that's the only way it can approach something that big. Our brains evolved to avoid lions, to move through forests, to understand faces and danger and movement, not to understand the birth of a universe. So when something becomes too large, too abstract, too far beyond everyday experience, we translate it into something we can stand inside, a scene, and then a story. Humans have always done this. When something becomes too complex to explain directly, we turn it into narrative. We don't just describe the world, we place ourselves inside it. Look at ancient Greece, the Iliad. It's not just a record of events, it's a world. A hero faces chaos, pride destroys kings, sacrifice restores order. You don't read it like data, you enter it. You feel what it means to act, to fail, to choose. Now look at biblical stories. They don't present arguments, they present situations. A fall, a betrayal, a sacrifice, a chance for redemption. Again, you don't analyze them like a report, you experience them. And the same thing happens in modern films. The Matrix. A character realizes his world is not what it seems. He struggles, he doubts, he sacrifices. Different technology, different language, but something feels familiar, because the structure is the same. We call these patterns archetypes, recurring shapes in human stories. The hero, the fall, the sacrifice, the return. But this is where things become strange. Where do they come from? Why do we recognize them instantly? Why does a story from ancient Greece, a religious text and a modern film feel connected? How far back do these patterns go? Before writing? Before language? Before organized societies? We don't really know. And because the similarities are so obvious, people often try to explain them in simple ways. They say Christianity borrowed from Greek mythology or films borrow from religion. But that explanation feels incomplete, because it assumes a chain of copying, and what we actually see is something deeper. The same patterns appearing again and again in different places at different times through completely different people. There's an old idea that helps make sense of this. Imagine people living inside a cave. They're facing a wall. They've been there their entire lives. Behind them, a fire burns. Between the fire and their backs, objects pass. And all they ever see are shadows projected onto a wall. Those shadows are their reality. They name them, they build stories around them. They think they understand what they're seeing. Now, imagine one person turns around. For the first time, he sees the fire. He sees the objects casting the shadows. And eventually, he leaves the cave. He steps outside, he sees the sun. He sees the real world that was creating everything. When he comes back and tries to explain this, no one believes him, because the shadows are all they've ever known. Maybe archetypes work in a similar way. Maybe different cultures are looking at the same shadows, trying to describe patterns that are too complex to see directly. Patterns of behavior, of meaning, of what leads to order and what leads to chaos. And the easiest way to describe those patterns is through stories, not because the stories are literally true, but because they are structurally true. They place you inside the situation. They show you what happens if you act one way or another. That's why myths, religions, and films feel familiar. They're different stories pointing toward the same deeper structure. In my photography project Horos, I explore something similar, not with words, with images. Rhythm inside stillness, patterns inside landscapes, shapes repeating, structures balancing. Even when nothing moves, the image can feel almost musical. You look at it and something makes sense, not logically, but immediately. You recognize the pattern even if you can't explain it. Places like Meteora makes this visible. Rocks rise vertically from the earth, monasteries sit at the very top. The entire landscape points upward. There's no confusion about direction. Everything leads somewhere, it has order, it has hierarchy, and our lives work the same way. Something always sits above everything else, whether we realize it or not. Today, we have more information than ever before. News, podcasts, social media, AI, endless input. Everything appears next to everything else. Equal weight, equal visibility. But nothing tells us what should come first. And when everything feels equally important, nothing truly is. Nothing guides sacrifice. Nothing helps you decide what to give up in order to move towards something else. That's why modern life often feels confusing, not because we lack information, but because we lack orientation. So let's return to the beginning. Why do you work? Because something sits at the top of your life. Maybe it's money, maybe it's freedom, maybe it's status, maybe it's your family, maybe it's something you haven't clearly named yet, but it's there. And whether you think about it or not, your decisions slowly bend around it. Facts describe the world, but what comes first decides how you live inside it. You don't live inside information, you live inside what you place above it.